Well, I was going to talk a bit about this last week, but it obviously felt right last week to give time to reflecting on the life of Queen Elizabeth and her witness. So I want to do what I was going to do last week, this week, if that makes sense. And what I want to do really is just talk a little bit about purpose. So I want to talk a bit about our purpose as a church. And in doing so, I want to try and, I guess, set some sort of direction, I guess, for the year that lies ahead, the academic year that lies ahead. So a few months ago, I was writing a document. It's a bit of a boring story, really, but I'm going to start with it anyway. I just was writing something to help people who are joining with helping out with our Sunday mornings. A document to try and explain to them why we do what we do, why it's important, and how to do it. It's just a very practical thing that I was writing, hopefully for the benefit of new people who are joining in on our Sunday morning teams. And as I was writing that, I wrote this. I was just writing a little introduction, and I wrote this phrase. I wrote the phrase, "We're one team helping people encounter God and become more like Jesus for the sake of the world." We're one team helping people encounter God and become more like Jesus for the sake of the world. And as I wrote those words, I just felt like the Lord sort of speaking to me, just felt quickened in my spirit, that God was just impressing upon me, that is what He wants us to be about as a church. That really is what He wants us as a church to be about. We want to be a people who help others encounter God, become more like Jesus for the sake of the world. And so I just want to talk a bit about those three things this morning. So the first thing is that we want to be people who meet with God, encounter God, and we want to be people who help others encounter God. And you know, the Bible, you'll know this obviously, but the Bible is full of the stories of men and women and children who encountered God and had their lives radically transformed for the better as a result of those encounters. Actually, if we went around this room and we spoke to each person, probably most of us would have a story of how we have encountered God in some way, probably on many occasions, and had our lives transformed as a result of that. You know, we as a people, we don't just want to be social services for Sherwood, do we? We don't just want to be social services for Sherwood. We do want to care for our community, but we don't just want to be social services for Sherwood. Actually, we have an amazing message to share, an amazing gospel, the gospel of the kingdom, to share with people. And our hope as a church, as God's people here, is that through us we might help people encounter God for themselves and have their lives transformed as a result of that encounter. One of the prayers that's before the community larder, we always gather as a little team for prayer. And one of the prayers that I think is most frequently prayed is, Lord, would you help us today not just to give out physical bread, but would you help us be people through which others might receive that spiritual life-giving bread. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And that's our longing, isn't it? It's not just to feed people physical bread, but it's that through us, people might come to encounter Jesus for themselves. So we want to be a people who we want to encounter God, but we want to be a people who help others to encounter God for themselves. The second thing is that we want to be a people, we want to be a community in which and through which people become more like Jesus. Do you know, following Jesus is not just about knowing about Jesus, following Jesus is about knowing Jesus and becoming more like him. We don't become Christians just so that we can answer the Bible questions in the local pub quiz. I don't know if any of you have been in that situation where you've been in the tiebreaker, your team's done really well. I've been there a couple of times, and you might be in the tiebreaker to win, and then they say that's a Bible question, and everybody on your team goes, great, and they all look at you, you're the Christian, and when you're the vicar it's even worse. And you're just thinking, Lord, please let it be an easy question. Let it not be so easy that everybody knows it, Lord, but let it be easy enough that I know it. And so I can still look good in front of them, Lord, but, anyway, it doesn't matter. But, do you know, we don't give our lives to Jesus and follow Jesus just so that we can answer the Bible question in the pub quiz. We give our lives to Jesus. We follow Jesus because he's inviting us to become like him. The word, it's often said that the word discipleship is often best translated in our modern English as the word apprentice. When you apprentice with somebody, let's say you're going to start out to be an apprentice plumber, the point of your apprenticeship is that you learn how to do plumbing like the person that you're with. That's the point of it. You're learning to plumb like that person. So that in a number of years' time, when you're sitting there in front of somebody's boiler or in someone's bathroom with springing a crazy leak, you know what to do because you've become like the person that you apprenticed from. And the point of following Jesus, the reason Jesus invited people to follow him was to become like him. In other words, that people might think and act and understand and process and just be like Jesus. That's why rabbis called people. That's why it was such an honor to be called by a rabbi to be their disciple. And that's why Jesus calls us to be like him. And so we want to be a people, a community here, in which we and others become more like Jesus. So that when you're faced with the challenges of your life, when you're faced with the challenges of relationships or children or challenges in your workplace, challenges in your team meeting, challenges on your spreadsheet, challenges in life, that actually you approach those challenges in the way that Jesus would approach those challenges if he was sitting in your place. That we are people who are learning to become more and more like Jesus. And the third thing is that we are encountering God and helping others to encounter God. But we're encountering God and we're becoming more like Jesus, not just for our own sake, but actually for the sake of others. There is, of course, huge benefit in encountering God and becoming more like Jesus. There is huge personal gain in those things. You think of the stories through the Gospels of the people that encountered Jesus and had their lives transformed as a result of that. You can instantly see personal gain in meeting Jesus. But we don't just pursue those things for our own benefit. We pursue those things also for the benefit of the world, for the sake of those who don't yet know Jesus. So that actually when people meet us, they meet people who have encountered God and are on a journey of becoming more and more like Jesus. When they meet us, in essence, they meet the presence of God and the person of Jesus through us. It's a pale reflection, maybe, but it is a reflection nonetheless. The verse that's often used to sum up the gospel from the Bible is John 3:16. It says, God so loved the world, that he gave his only son. We learn a number of things from the verse, but two things we definitely learn from the verse is firstly that God's position towards the world is one of love. It's one of an extreme love for what he has created. And the second thing, of course, is that he is generously disposed towards all that he's created. So much so that he would come in the person of Jesus. And so we want to be people who encounter God, become more like Jesus, not just for our own benefit, but actually for the benefit of others. And I just want to illustrate that just very simply from the story of Zacchaeus this morning, just to root those things in a story from the scriptures. You will know, because you've just heard the story, but you'll also know from many years of attending Sunday school or something of that nature, that Zacchaeus was a tax collector. And that meant, in essence, that Zacchaeus had no friends. Nobody liked Zacchaeus, and for very, very good reason. The way the tax system worked in Rome was that you would be given a region. Let's say the borough of Tunbridge Wells would be your region. The Romans would say to you, this borough should be paying us X number of pounds in tax. It is your responsibility to get it from them. Anything you have beyond that is yours. And so tax collectors were very skillful at cheating and taking money from people, and they would use all sorts of means to do that. Threats, violence, lies, all sorts of things. And consequently, people hated tax collectors. And so Zacchaeus was someone who had no friends, and was probably someone who was responsible for doing some pretty unpleasant things. But I think there was a part in Zacchaeus' heart where there was something in him where he knew that his life had not turned out as he maybe had hoped it would have done. Because I think if you'd spoken to Zacchaeus when he was 8 and you'd sat next to him in his school and said, Zacchaeus, what do you want to be when you grow up? Zacchaeus would not have put his hand up and said, I want to be a tax collector. He would have put his hand up and he said, I want to be a fireman. I want to be a farmer. I want to be a footballer. I want to be a vet. But actually, what's happened is somewhere in his life, something has happened. And Zacchaeus now finds himself in a situation where he is a tax collector and he has no friends. And I think probably there was some part of him that deeply regretted the fact that that had happened and that his life had come to that. And Zacchaeus is, I imagine he was pretty bright. I imagine he was pretty well connected. And Zacchaeus would have known something about Jesus. And he hears that Jesus is coming to Jericho, his hometown. And Zacchaeus decides that he wants to see Jesus. He wants to see him. And I think that Zacchaeus would have known that Jesus seemed to specialize in fresh starts and new beginnings. I don't know whether maybe, Zacchaeus and Levi met at the sort of tax collector's lunch one day, and, Zacchaeus heard the story of how Levi had met Jesus and now he was called Matt. I don't know. But Zacchaeus, I think, would have known that Jesus was somebody who seemed to specialize in new beginnings and fresh starts. And Zacchaeus decides that when Jesus comes to the town, he's gonna see him for himself. And so Zacchaeus is vertically challenged, and so he decides to climb a tree. I could make a joke, but I can't think of one. Anyway, but so he climbs a tree and to watch Jesus come into Jericho. And Jesus comes in and he starts doing the stuff that Jesus does, no doubt. He's talking to people and laughing with people and sharing with people and maybe picking up children and blessing them and praying for the sick and talking to people about the kingdom of God and doing all of those things. And Zacchaeus is happy in his sycamore tree, and he's watching Jesus, and he's seeing all of the different things that Jesus is doing. And of course, as Jesus kind of progresses down the road, it's as if Jesus gets closer and closer and closer until there comes a point where Jesus is literally standing underneath the tree where Zacchaeus is sitting. And so Zacchaeus is in this tree looking right down upon Jesus and seeing all the stuff that he does. And then there's this amazing moment where Jesus turns to Zacchaeus, looks up at him and says, Zacchaeus, I thought I might come to your house for a cup of tea this afternoon. And I imagine if I was Zacchaeus, I would think a number of things at that point. The first thing I would think was like, how did he know my name? That would occur to me. I think the second thing I'd think is, what state did the kids leave the kitchen in? That would go through my mind almost immediately. Oh my goodness, what state is the kitchen? And then of course I blame it on the children, but really, what state did I leave the kitchen in? And then I would think, have we got any milk? They would be my three questions. But I imagine Zacchaeus thought the same. But anyway, Zacchaeus, after thinking those three things, he climbs down the tree and he's like, yes. And he takes Jesus into his house, and they have some time together. And we don't know what's said in that conversation, but we do know what happens as a result of it. And Zacchaeus comes out of that encounter with Jesus, and he says to the people, he says, I will give half of what I have to the poor. Zacchaeus probably would have been a very, very wealthy man. So he said, half of what I have, I'm going to give it away to the poor. And if I've cheated you out of anything, I will pay you back 4 times what I owe you. And it's just like the most amazing moment. You can imagine the crowd hearing what Zacchaeus says. It's just like an incredible moment. And I guess as we think about that story, we see those three things, encounter, becoming more like Jesus for the sake of God. We see those things in that story because it all begins with an encounter with Jesus. Zacchaeus meets Jesus for himself. He might have heard about Jesus. He might have seen other people that met with Jesus. He might know some stuff about Jesus. But on this day in Jericho, Zacchaeus meets with Jesus for himself. And in that moment, through that conversation and that whatever happened when Jesus and Zacchaeus had that private moment together, in that moment, Zacchaeus begins to become more like Jesus. There's something in Zacchaeus where his heart is changed. And he begins to become more like Jesus. I'm sure there was a really long way still to go. There's actually some historical evidence to suggest that later on in his life, Zacchaeus, I can't remember which apostle it was, but he actually became a disciple of one of the apostles and ended up serving one of the apostles in a foreign city, significant city. We don't know if that's 100% true, but there's evidence to suggest that it might be the case. But Zacchaeus in that moment begins to become more like Jesus. And his life is transformed. And it isn't just for his benefit, but as he comes out of that place and he says, I'm going to give half of what I have to the poor. I mean, that would have been transformational for that community. And then he says to them, if I've cheated you, I'll give you 4 times what I've cheated you. Again, that would have been absolutely transformational for those people. And Zacchaeus' encounter with Jesus and his journey of beginning to become more and more like Jesus, its outworking is actually it's for him himself, but it's also in the world. That actually the community itself begins to be transformed because of the transformation that's taken place in Zacchaeus' life. It's an amazing story. Jesus gives him this fresh start. And we see the impact of that encounter. And so I guess, I just want us to be a bunch of people here whose hearts are set on encountering Jesus for ourselves. That's actually when we come to church, that's what we long for. We long to meet him. We long to climb down the sycamore tree and rush into that place just to be with Jesus. And that we would be a people who are helping one another on that journey of becoming more like Jesus. That actually tomorrow you're a little bit more like Jesus in your office, workplace, your college, whatever it might be. And that the outworking of that is not just for you. It's not just for us, but it's actually for the blessing, for the benefit, for the sake of the world which God loves and is so generously disposed towards. So I guess that's just my hope for us as a church family over these coming weeks and months. I mean, I guess it's always my hope, but I just felt like it would be good just to remind us at the beginning of this new academic year. It's the journey that we want to be on. And Zacchaeus exemplifies it in just a wonderful way as he has that moment with Jesus in Jericho all those years ago. Let's just be still for a moment.